Summer of 1944. The sun rose high over the flat plains of Texas, bleaching the roofs of barracks and the endless fences of Camp Hearn. Inside one of those wooden buildings, a young German corporal sat on his bunk with a newspaper folded neatly in his hands. The paper smelled faintly of ink and dust, the kind of smell that reminded him of peacetime, of mornings in Hamburg when news still seemed to belong to ordinary life. Across the front page, printed in heavy black letters, ran a headline that he struggled to comprehend at first. The words were foreign but familiar enough to recognize: Prisoners of War, Geneva Convention, Rights. It took him a few moments to realize that the article was not about American soldiers captured abroad, but about men like him, living behind the very fence that surrounded his barracks. The newspaper had been left deliberately in the recreation hall by one of the American guards, who treated it as casually as any piece of public information. For the guard, it was just another issue of the New Yorker or the local Texas Daily. For the prisoner, it was a revelation. In the Third Reich, the existence of captured soldiers had been a stain to erase from memory. No German paper would have printed their names or conditions. To be captured was to vanish, to become a shameful absence. Yet here, in the land of the enemy, their situation was not hidden but discussed openly, even debated. The American public, it seemed, had the right to question how their army treated prisoners, and the army had the obligation to answer. Outside, the camp moved with the monotony of routine, the bugle calls, the work details, the roll calls. But inside that newspaper lay something that unsettled the order of captivity. The article explained the Geneva Convention of 1929, the international code that dictated how prisoners of war were to be fed, housed, and employed. It spoke of obligations, inspections, correspondence rights, and medical care. It mentioned that violations of these rules could bring shame not only on the military but on the entire nation. The language was factual, almost bureaucratic, yet beneath its calm tone was a profound statement: even in war, there were boundaries. The corporal did not understand every word, but he recognized names and references: Geneva, Red Cross, inspection, dignity. He ran his finger over the photographs that accompanied the article: American officers standing beside rows of German prisoners, smiling faintly for the camera. The image was not one of triumph but of order. It was not propaganda in the way he had been taught to see it. There were no slogans, no calls for hatred, only a cold insistence that rules existed even here, in this strange place far from the front. In Germany, newspapers had become instruments of control, voices that echoed only what the regime demanded. They printed victory reports, heroic obituaries, and statistics of destroyed enemy tanks. Words like rights and convention had vanished from the public vocabulary. To see them revived, printed openly in English on foreign paper, felt like witnessing a forbidden act. The corporal realized that this country fought its war differently, not only with bombs and rifles, but with laws, discussions, and questions. For the Americans, such journalism was ordinary, another example of a free press at work during wartime. For the prisoners, it was incomprehensible. They were used to silence and censorship, not to transparency. And yet this small piece of newsprint, carried casually through the gates by a guard, became a window into another civilization. It showed that even in the midst of global destruction, there were people who believed that justice and humanity should not be suspended. The corporal folded the paper carefully and placed it beside his bunk, as if it were something fragile. Around him, other prisoners continued their routine, unaware that a few printed pages had just challenged everything he thought he understood about power. The newspaper did not speak in slogans or commands. It spoke in principles, written in plain ink, but backed by the moral force of a society that trusted its citizens to know the truth. In that camp under the blinding Texas sun, a single headline became the quietest, most powerful reminder that even war could not silence the rule of law. For the German prisoners, the most disorienting part of captivity in the United States was not the physical hardship, or even the sense of defeat, but the openness with which their existence was discussed. In Germany, the mere fact of being taken prisoner had carried a stigma almost worse than death. Nazi propaganda insisted that surrender was treason against the fatherland. Soldiers who fell into enemy hands were erased from public life, their families received no official acknowledgement, and newspapers never mentioned their names. The Reich portrayed war as a moral test of will, where capture equaled weakness, and weakness had no place in the national myth. By contrast, in America, the prisoners found themselves not only housed, fed, and medically treated but also written about, analyzed in public debates, described in reports, and photographed for magazines. Their condition was not a shameful secret but part of a national conversation. The contradiction struck them deeply. Behind the barbed wire, they lived under strict routines, counted, searched, guarded, assigned to labor details, yet outside the fence, their fate was a matter of civic concern. Newspapers printed editorials discussing whether the army was meeting the standards of the 1929 Geneva Convention, and whether generosity toward captured enemies might undermine morale. Citizens wrote letters to editors praising or criticizing the government's policy toward the prisoners. Some demanded harsher treatment, arguing that American boys were dying overseas while the Germans enjoyed warm food and recreation. Others defended the policy as a moral duty, claiming that how America treated its prisoners would define the justice of its cause. For a society used to secrecy, this level of public scrutiny seemed unthinkable. The prisoners came from a culture where truth was controlled, where every article served a political purpose and every image was filtered through propaganda. They had grown up reading papers that glorified sacrifice and erased dissent. In their world, law was something invoked to justify power, not to limit it. Yet, in the United States, even during total war, the press remained a forum of disagreement. Journalists questioned the government's compliance with international law. Columnists quoted the Geneva Convention directly, explaining that prisoners were entitled to correspondence, religious services, and fair labor conditions. This did not mean that all Americans agreed. Some found the policy too lenient, but the very existence of debate revealed something that the prisoners could barely grasp. A nation at war could still question itself. The American government, aware of the global attention to its conduct, allowed these discussions to continue. It understood that moral credibility was as important as victory. Reports from the War Department and the Office of War Information confirmed that public transparency would serve as a counterweight to Axis propaganda. If the United States could demonstrate that it respected the Geneva Convention, it would reinforce the image of a lawful and civilized power. This idea resonated in editorials and public statements. The contrast could not have been sharper. While Nazi Germany silenced its own citizens and concealed its violations of international law, the American press turned the question of ethics in war into an ongoing conversation. Inside the camps, the prisoners began to notice how information itself functioned as a kind of discipline. The presence of reporters, inspections by the International Red Cross, and the steady arrival of newspapers reminded them that the rules governing their captivity were not arbitrary. Their guards acted not only out of authority but under the gaze of a public that expected accountability. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with a system where power was constrained by visibility, where actions could be discussed, documented, and judged. The very idea that the rights of an enemy could be written about in print seemed absurd and yet strangely stabilizing. For the Americans, this openness was not sentimental, it was pragmatic. It maintained domestic morale, demonstrated national values, and protected captured U.S. soldiers abroad through reciprocity. For the Germans, it exposed the fragility of the worldview they had been taught to believe. They discovered that a society could fight ruthlessly and still acknowledge limits, that an enemy could both conquer and obey the law. In this realization lay the deeper psychological shock of captivity. The barbed wire defined their physical boundary, but the newspapers revealed another, invisible one, the moral frontier between two civilizations. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States became the unexpected custodian of one of the largest populations of Axis prisoners of war in history. By the end of the conflict, more than 370,000 German prisoners, along with approximately 50,000 Italians and several thousand Japanese, were held in camps scattered across 46 American states. Most of the Germans had been captured after the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa in 1943, when Operation Torch and the subsequent Allied victories at Tunis and Bizerta brought entire divisions into Allied custody. The British, overwhelmed by the logistical burden of feeding and housing tens of thousands of prisoners in Egypt and Libya, arranged for the United States to transport a large portion of them across the Atlantic. By late 1943, Liberty's ships returning empty from supply runs to Europe and Africa carried their unexpected cargo, prisoners instead of weapons. The sudden arrival of so many captives created an immense logistical challenge for the U.S. Army. The War Department placed responsibility for their management under the Provost Marshal General's office, which in turn established a network of base camps and branch camps across the continental United States. The first major facilities appeared in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, later expanding northward into the Midwest and even into remote areas of the Great Plains. By 1945, there were more than 400 primary and secondary sites, ranging from vast compounds like Camp Swift and Camp Hearn in Texas to small work detachments attached to farms, sawmills, and factories. Each camp was required to operate under the principles of the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, to which the United States was a signatory. This international framework dictated standards for housing, medical care, rations, discipline, and labor. The U.S. Army took those obligations seriously, both for humanitarian reasons and for practical ones. Officials hoped that visible compliance would encourage Axis powers to reciprocate with captured Americans in Europe. Consequently, German POWs received the same basic rations as U.S. soldiers, had access to medical services, and were permitted to organize religious services and educational programs. The existence of such humane treatment did not go unnoticed by the public. As early as 1943, major newspapers and magazines began publishing reports and photographs from inside the camps. Journalists were allowed limited access under supervision, and publications like Life, Collier's, and the New Yorker ran features describing camp life, agricultural labor projects, and recreational activities. While some articles emphasized the efficiency of American organization, others framed the story in moral and legal terms, explaining that these prisoners were under the custody of a democratic nation bound by law, not vengeance. The media often quoted sections of the Geneva Convention, translating its legal language into plain English for readers who wanted to know why their government was feeding and housing the enemy. This public transparency was unusual for wartime. The American press enjoyed wide latitude to cover issues related to prisoners, and public debate reflected the country's dual identity, at once pragmatic and idealistic. Editorials appeared questioning whether the standards were too generous, while others insisted that the integrity of the United States depended on adhering strictly to international law. The War Department understood that allowing controlled visibility would serve both moral and strategic purposes. It demonstrated to the world that the United States fought according to rules, and it offered a stark contrast to Axis secrecy and brutality. Within the camps, the Germans themselves were aware of this attention. Many of them encountered American publications for the first time in the camp libraries or recreation halls. The magazines, censored for content but not rewritten, conveyed a tone utterly foreign to them, calm, factual, and often critical of authority. They could see that American society tolerated discussion even during total war. The difference between the open press they now observed and the censored media they had known at home was not simply cultural. It represented a completely different relationship between the state and the individual. By 1945, the system of POW camps in the United States had become an unlikely experiment in democracy under the pressures of global conflict. Inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed that, in general, the camps maintained the standards set by the Geneva Convention. The American press continued to report on these inspections, often quoting from Red Cross summaries to reassure readers that the nation's conduct remained lawful and humane. For the prisoners, these publications became a constant reminder that they were not invisible. For historians, they would later stand as evidence of a remarkable wartime paradox, that even in an age defined by destruction, one of the combatant nations found a way to turn legality and publicity into instruments of moral power. The turning point came in 1943, when reports began to reach the United States describing the harsh treatment of Allied prisoners held in German and Japanese camps. Letters from captured American airmen filtered through the International Red Cross, and stories from repatriated prisoners confirmed what many feared, that the Geneva Convention was being violated across Axis-controlled territories. The accounts included forced labor near combat zones, inadequate rations, and brutal discipline in Stalag and offlog camps. In the Pacific, the situation was even more dire, as Japan had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. These revelations stirred public anger, but they also forced a difficult question: how should America respond to barbarity without abandoning its own principles? By mid-1943, the War Department and the Office of War Information understood that the issue could not be left to rumor. They launched a coordinated effort to remind both soldiers and civilians that the United States was bound by law to treat its prisoners humanely. The purpose was twofold: to maintain discipline within the armed forces and to demonstrate to the world that democracy did not suspend its conscience during war. This message soon reached the press. Major newspapers began publishing explanatory articles about the Geneva Convention, outlining what was required of the American military and why these obligations mattered. The tone of the coverage was instructive rather than emotional. The public was told that the rights granted to German prisoners were not a privilege, but a legal duty, an expression of national integrity. At the same time, civic groups and churches joined the discussion. The National Catholic Welfare Council and Protestant associations urged respect for the convention, warning that mistreatment of Axis prisoners could endanger American captives abroad. Humanitarian organizations echoed this sentiment, arguing that adherence to the law would serve as moral insurance for U.S. soldiers in enemy hands. Editorials in papers such as the New York Times and the Christian Science Monitor repeated the same refrain: civilization was measured by restraint, not revenge. The contrast with Axis propaganda was clear. While Nazi Germany broadcast images of vengeful democracies, the United States answered with public transparency and moral reasoning. Within the military itself, this principle took on a practical dimension. The Provost Marshal General's office issued bulletins reminding camp commanders that compliance with the Geneva Convention was not optional. Training manuals outlined how to conduct inspections, distribute rations, and handle discipline without resorting to cruelty. These documents, some of which were later declassified, emphasized that humane treatment was essential to the efficiency and reputation of the U.S. Army. It was not simply an act of mercy but an operational standard. In internal memoranda, War Department officials noted that every incident of abuse could become a propaganda weapon for the Axis powers. Thus, moral conduct was reframed as a matter of national security. Public awareness of these policies deepened as journalists gained limited access to POW facilities. Articles from 1943 and 1944 described German prisoners working in American fields, attending English classes, or building furniture for military use. Photographs showed them smiling, playing soccer, or attending religious services, images that would have been impossible under the Nazi press system. The portrayal was deliberate. It demonstrated that the United States, even while fighting total war, retained faith in law and decency. For American readers, such coverage reinforced the idea that moral consistency distinguished them from their enemies. For the prisoners, it revealed an unexpected humanity behind the fences. By late 1944, the theme of ethical warfare had entered the national consciousness. The War Department published pamphlets reminding citizens that fair treatment of German prisoners upheld America's global image and encouraged reciprocal behavior abroad. Propaganda films produced by the Office of War Information presented the American soldier as both warrior and custodian of law. This public narrative did not eliminate cruelty or error. Violations did occur, but it created an atmosphere where mistreatment was recognized as shameful, not heroic. In this sense, 1943 marked the beginning of a moral campaign as much as a military one. The exposure of Axis atrocities did not push the United States toward vengeance but toward self-definition. The more the enemy ignored the Geneva Convention, the more determined America became to embody it. By choosing legality over hatred, The nation sought to prove that civilization's strength lay not in its power to destroy, but in its ability to restrain itself. The implementation of America's prisoner of war policy evolved from simple containment to an ambitious social and educational experiment. By 1944, as it became clear that thousands of German captives would remain on U.S. soil for years, the War Department began to view their custody not merely as a logistical problem but as an opportunity for ideological rehabilitation. The task fell to a small but influential branch of the Army's Psychological Warfare Division, later formalized under the Provost Marshal General's Office as the Special Projects Division. Its mission was to use education, media, and structured dialogue to expose German prisoners to democratic values and counter the totalitarian conditioning instilled by Nazi propaganda. The groundwork for this program began with the realization that a significant portion of the prisoners were educated men, former teachers, journalists, engineers, and students, who could understand and reflect on ideas beyond basic military obedience. Early Red Cross reports and interviews with prisoners revealed stark ideological divisions within the camps. A minority of hardline Nazis continued to dominate social life and intimidate moderate or apolitical inmates. American authorities decided that the best countermeasure was not censorship alone, but re-education, not by force, but by exposure to alternative systems of thought. In 1944, the War Department approved the creation of educational curricula within the camps. Under the supervision of the Special Projects Division, classes were introduced on subjects such as history, political science, literature, and English language instruction. The program was voluntary but heavily encouraged, and by 1945, more than half of the German prisoners in the United States had participated in some form of academic or vocational training. The instructors were often captured German officers and intellectuals vetted for anti-Nazi sympathies, assisted by American educators and military chaplains. The courses were designed not to humiliate but to reconstruct a sense of critical inquiry, something the Nazi education system had systematically destroyed. The centerpiece of this effort became the publication of a German-language newspaper titled Der Ruf, The Call, launched in March 1945. Edited and largely written by German prisoners under close American supervision, the paper combined news articles, essays, cultural reviews, and commentary on world events. Each issue was reviewed by U.S. officers from the Special Projects Division to ensure accuracy and avoid overt propaganda, yet the tone was notably independent compared to official military bulletins. Der Ruf sought to demonstrate what a free and responsible press could look like: factual, reflective, and open to discussion. Articles questioned militarism, analyzed the roots of dictatorship, and presented democratic governance as a system of accountability rather than chaos. For many readers, it was their first encounter with journalism unshackled from party control. Distribution of Der Ruf extended far beyond its initial audience. Copies circulated among more than 500 camps, reaching an estimated 75,000 German prisoners. The project's success led to related initiatives, radio broadcasts, film screenings, and lending libraries stocked with translated works of Western philosophy and literature. Prisoners were encouraged to form discussion groups, stage theater performances, and publish local camp newsletters. Even sports and music programs were used as tools of re-education, reinforcing cooperation and respect for rules. American newspapers continued to report on these activities throughout 1945, often framing them as evidence of moral consistency and cultural sophistication. Photographs in Life and regional papers showed German POWs attending lectures, building furniture, or planting crops, images meant to contrast sharply with the brutality of Axis labor camps. Journalists described how the re-education initiative was teaching democracy behind barbed wire, portraying it as both humane and practical. By cultivating moderation and literacy among prisoners, officials hoped to plant seeds for Germany's post-war reconstruction. The program's architects were careful to avoid the appearance of indoctrination. Official memoranda emphasized that the goal was education, not conversion. The War Department instructed officers to present democratic principles through example rather than command, through open debate, access to information, and the practice of responsibility. When the war ended, the program expanded into Europe, forming the basis for the German-language magazine Neue Zeitung and, eventually, the civilian continuation of Der Ruf in the American occupation zone. Several former prisoner editors, such as Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, would later become leading figures in post-war German literature and the founders of Group 47, the circle that reshaped West Germany's cultural identity. By the time the last German prisoners left the United States in 1946, the Special Projects Division had created one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the war, one that relied not on coercion but on the power of words, discussion, and intellectual dignity. The process proved that education could serve as both a weapon and a bridge, a means to confront ideology without replicating its brutality. For the German prisoners scattered across America's vast network of camps, the experience of captivity was often defined less by deprivation than by disorientation. Many of them arrived expecting hostility or neglect, conditioned by years of propaganda that depicted the United States as a nation of moral hypocrisy and racial chaos. Instead, they found a system governed by routines, regulations, and a kind of impersonal fairness that was almost more unsettling than cruelty. Life inside the camps was highly structured: morning roll calls, work assignments, mail distribution, inspections, and mealtimes repeated with military precision. But the true shock came not from discipline itself, rather from the atmosphere of openness that surrounded it. Those who could read English soon became informal interpreters and storytellers. They read American newspapers aloud to their comrades, translating editorials that discussed prisoner conditions, letters to the editor debating the Geneva Convention, or local reports about German labor detachments helping with the harvest. For men who had grown up in a world of censorship, it was a revelation that their situation, down to the details of food rations and work rules, was being discussed publicly, without fear or secrecy. The very act of reading about themselves in a free press was an encounter with a different moral universe. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir that this was the first time he realized that truth could exist without permission. The guards, many of whom were citizen soldiers or National Guard members, often encouraged this exchange of information. In some camps, officers deliberately left copies of the New York Times, Life, or local dailies in the recreation halls. At Camp Hearn in Texas and Camp Algona in Iowa, English-language newspapers circulated freely, and libraries were stocked with both censored and uncensored materials, including American novels and magazines. The intention was partly pedagogical and partly pragmatic. Exposure to open discussion would serve as a quiet form of re-education. The prisoners were not lectured on democracy. They were allowed to observe it in action. As the war continued, these small acts of transparency began to reshape how many Germans perceived their captors. When they saw photographs in Life magazine depicting POW camps much like their own, accompanied by articles explaining the moral importance of humane treatment, they understood that American society was watching its army closely. There was comfort and unease in that awareness. Comfort, because it meant their lives were visible and protected. Unease, because it revealed that even a nation at war could tolerate dissent and criticism. In Germany, such self-scrutiny would have been labeled defeatism. In America, it was part of patriotism itself. For prisoners who had been members of the Hitler Youth or officers steeped in Nazi ideology, this realization produced deep internal conflict. They had been taught that democracy was weak, fragmented, and decadent. Yet what they witnessed contradicted that completely. The system around them seemed stronger precisely because it accepted disagreement. American guards debated politics openly. Newspapers criticized military policy. Even in the middle of a global war, information flowed with astonishing freedom. Some prisoners resented this, interpreting it as arrogance. Others began to see it as a form of strength rooted not in fear, but in confidence. Personal testimonies collected after the war revealed that many German prisoners found the consistency of American conduct more persuasive than any formal propaganda. The steady observance of the Geneva Convention, the predictable meals, the access to mail, the Red Cross inspections, combined with visible freedom of the press, created an atmosphere of credibility. The prisoners could see that the law was not a slogan. It was applied, monitored, and discussed by civilians and soldiers alike. In interviews conducted by the War Department in 1945, many captives reported that their perception of America had shifted from an image of a decadent industrial empire to that of a lawful and principled society. There were also subtle moments that left lasting impressions: guards who corrected themselves to follow procedure, officers who explained why prisoners received the same rations as American troops, chaplains who invited them to church services without coercion. These gestures, ordinary to the Americans, were extraordinary to men who came from a system that equated obedience with virtue and mercy with weakness. The combination of visible justice and freedom of information created a new kind of authority, one based not on fear, but on consistency. By 1945, the cumulative effect of these experiences had begun to alter the outlook of many German prisoners. When they finally returned home, they often spoke less about the food or the work, and more about the strange civility of their captivity. They had lived behind fences, but for the first time, they had seen a society that allowed truth to cross those fences freely. For men who had grown up in a dictatorship built on silence, that experience would prove more subversive than any punishment could have been. The openness of America's prisoner of war system created consequences that extended far beyond the fences of the camps. What began as a wartime necessity gradually evolved into a social experiment that shaped not only the reputation of the United States, but also the political consciousness of thousands of men who would later return to rebuild Germany. The constant visibility of how the American government treated its prisoners, through press reports, public debate, and official transparency, turned the very act of captivity into a lesson in civic ethics. For the American public, it became proof that the nation's ideals were not theoretical but lived. For the prisoners, it became their first encounter with a functioning democracy. The U.S. press played a decisive role in transforming the legal framework of the Geneva Convention into a living moral narrative. Newspapers explained complex principles in simple terms. Prisoners of war were not enemies to be humiliated but individuals protected by international law. Articles and photo essays in Life, Collier's, and the New York Times humanized the captives, showing them at work in fields or studying in classrooms, while editorials debated the proper balance between justice and mercy. This ongoing conversation reached into American homes and, through camp libraries, into the lives of the prisoners themselves. The press thus acted as a moral intermediary between the military and the public, ensuring that the treatment of POWs remained both transparent and accountable. Within the United States, this openness strengthened the country's image as a nation of law and conscience. Wartime propaganda from the Office of War Information incorporated these narratives into broader themes of democratic superiority. Radio programs, posters, and short films portrayed America as the civilization that fought not just to win wars but to preserve humanity in the process. The effect was double-edged. It reassured Americans that their sacrifices served a moral cause, and it projected to the world the idea that democracy could maintain ethical discipline even under existential pressure. In an era when atrocities dominated headlines, America's visible adherence to rules became a form of soft power, proof that legitimacy could be as persuasive as force. For the German prisoners, the influence was more intimate but no less profound. Exposure to American media, classroom discussions, and the camp newspaper Der Ruf had created an intellectual environment that contrasted sharply with the indoctrination of the Nazi years. When the war ended, many of these men were repatriated not as unthinking soldiers but as witnesses to another model of civic life. Among them were journalists, teachers, and intellectuals who had worked on Der Ruf under the supervision of the Special Projects Division. Upon their return to Germany, several of these editors, most notably Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, continued their work as writers and cultural figures, founding the literary circle known as Gruppe 47, which became instrumental in shaping the democratic identity of West Germany. Their post-war careers illustrated how the values absorbed behind barbed wire had spread into peacetime society. The lessons of press freedom, factual reporting, and moral accountability that they had practiced in the camp newspaper resurfaced in their post-war publications, which emphasized intellectual independence and the rejection of authoritarian thought. The influence of Der Ruf continued through its civilian successor, first published in Munich under U.S. occupation authorities. It became a leading voice of the early Federal Republic's re-education efforts, promoting democratic ideals and confronting the moral legacy of Nazism. American historians and policymakers later recognized the broader implications of this phenomenon. The humane and legally consistent treatment of prisoners had produced unintended but beneficial outcomes. It had not only safeguarded captured Americans abroad but also contributed to the moral reconstruction of a defeated enemy. The U.S. War Department's final report on the prisoner of war program in 1946 noted that compliance with international law had strengthened America's standing among nations and provided a basis of mutual respect necessary for post-war reconciliation. The impact of this policy reached into the emerging architecture of the post-war world. The United States' conduct with POWs became part of its moral capital in the founding of the United Nations and the drafting of the 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions. Scholars have since argued that the American example during World War II helped set the precedent for modern human rights law by proving that adherence to ethical standards was compatible with military success. For the prisoners themselves, the experience of being treated with dignity by a victorious enemy created an enduring paradox, one that many carried back to Europe. They had lost the war, but in the process, they had encountered a civilization that did not need cruelty to prove its strength. When they later spoke about America, they rarely mentioned the fences or the guards. They remembered the newspapers, the classrooms, and the quiet realization that a society could be both powerful and self-critical. It was this perception, repeated and retold across post-war Germany, that spread more effectively than any political campaign. In the long shadow of defeat, the memory of that freedom, learned behind the wire, became one of America's most lasting exports. In the years that followed the war, historians and policymakers came to see the American handling of Axis prisoners not merely as a logistical achievement, but as an ethical experiment that helped define the moral architecture of the 20th century. The United States had demonstrated, perhaps unintentionally, that legality could coexist with power, that a nation could wage total war without abandoning the restraints of law and conscience. The open discussion of prisoner treatment in American newspapers, the transparency of the War Department, and the supervision of the Red Cross together built an image of the United States as what later commentators would call a nation of law. This reputation did not emerge from idealism alone. It was carefully sustained by the press, which transformed the technical obligations of the 1929 Geneva Convention into a narrative of national integrity. By 1946, foreign observers, including journalists from Britain, France, and neutral countries such as Switzerland and Sweden, had remarked on the distinct American approach. Reports published by the International Committee of the Red Cross cited U.S. compliance with the convention as among the most consistent of any belligerent power. At a time when Europe was still haunted by revelations of atrocity, the American model offered a counterpoint. It suggested that the principles of democracy were not suspended in wartime but tested by it. For U.S. diplomats, this moral distinction became a valuable form of soft power in the early years of the Cold War. As the United States assumed global leadership, its conduct during the war, especially its public adherence to international law, served as evidence that democracy could maintain order without terror. The legacy of this conduct extended into institutions and doctrines that outlasted the war itself. The experiences of the 1940s influenced the 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, in which the United States played a major drafting role. Many of the new provisions, particularly those related to humane treatment, access to information, and Red Cross inspection, drew directly from American wartime practices. Legal scholars of the time noted that the POW system had demonstrated the feasibility of combining military necessity with humanitarian restraint. In military academies and law schools, these lessons were codified as part of the emerging field of international humanitarian law. At home, the public memory of the POW camps faded quickly compared to the drama of battlefield victories, yet the underlying idea, that a democracy must be accountable even to its enemies, remained a touchstone of American self-perception. Journalists and historians revisited the topic in later decades, often contrasting it with the secrecy and abuses of subsequent conflicts. The wartime press, once reporting daily on prisoner conditions, came to be viewed as a moral institution in its own right, an early demonstration of how freedom of information could serve as a form of ethical oversight. The newspapers of the 1940s had not simply chronicled events, they had acted as a bridge between law and public conscience, translating abstract treaties into the language of fairness and responsibility. In Germany, the influence took a different shape. Former prisoners who had experienced American transparency firsthand carried those lessons home, where they became part of the intellectual foundation of West Germany's democratic rebirth. The values of accountability and press freedom, encountered behind barbed wire, reappeared in the country's post-war media and political discourse. Historians have observed that these men, whether consciously or not, helped transmit an understanding of democracy grounded not in ideology but in procedure, the belief that justice required constant visibility. This legacy of moral discipline through openness distinguished post-war German journalism and civic culture from its authoritarian past. For the United States, the reflection on its wartime behavior remained both a source of pride and a measure of responsibility. Scholars have since debated whether the humane treatment of POWs stemmed from altruism, calculation, or self-interest. Yet regardless of motive, the outcome reinforced the idea that democratic strength lies not only in the capacity to fight but in the refusal to abandon law when it becomes inconvenient. Every headline printed during the war, every article explaining why a captured enemy still possessed rights, became a quiet reaffirmation of civilization's boundaries. Ultimately, the legacy of the American POW program and the public discourse surrounding it proved larger than the camps themselves. It demonstrated that free institutions could function under the pressures of global war, that moral authority could serve as a weapon of strategy, and that truth, when openly acknowledged, could disarm hatred more effectively than censorship. In the long reflection that followed 1945, historians concluded that America's greatest triumph in the field of law was not the punishment of its enemies, but the preservation of its own principles. The war had tested democracy in its most extreme form, and the United States had answered not with silence, but with publication, with the conviction that justice, to remain real, must be seen. The story of how America treated its prisoners of war was ultimately less about military policy than about a civilization testing the limits of its own moral endurance. In a world shattered by violence, the United States chose to prove that strength did not have to manifest as domination, and that justice could exist even when extended to the defeated. This decision was not born of sentimentality, it was an act of discipline. It reflected a conviction that democracy, to survive war, must be practiced precisely when it is most difficult to do so. The American press, by writing openly about the rights of German prisoners, performed a quiet but profound act of preservation. It safeguarded the principle that law must remain public, even when the subjects of that law are enemies. For the men held behind American fences, this experience was a form of moral dissonance. They had been raised in a society that equated mercy with weakness and obedience with virtue. In Nazi Germany, the state defined truth, and newspapers were not instruments of inquiry but weapons of belief. To see a free press discuss the conditions of their captivity, to witness a nation questioning its own behavior even in the midst of war, was to confront a reality that dismantled the moral logic of dictatorship. It showed them a version of power that was not absolute but accountable, a form of authority that drew legitimacy not from fear, but from restraint. The philosophical weight of this moment extended far beyond the prisoners themselves. It revealed something about the inner anatomy of democracy, that its survival depends not only on victory over enemies, but on victory over itself, over the temptation to abandon its ideals in moments of anger or fear. The American newspapers that published stories on the Geneva Convention, the Red Cross inspections, or the daily routines of POW camps were not simply reporting events, they were reaffirming the foundations of their own society. Every article was a reminder that civilization, if it is to endure, must remain visible, must explain itself, and must refuse to hide its conscience. In that sense, the American commitment to lawful conduct during war became a kind of self-portrait, a reflection of how the nation wished to be seen by others and by its own citizens. The act of making humane treatment public transformed morality into policy, and policy into narrative. It was not enough to behave ethically, it was necessary to be witnessed behaving ethically. Transparency itself became an instrument of justice. The open discussion of enemy rights in wartime press columns served as proof that democracy could incorporate criticism without collapsing, that it could look directly at its own contradictions and still stand. For the German prisoners, the experience became a quiet education in freedom. The sight of guards obeying rules, of officers explaining procedures rather than hiding them, of journalists who were not state functionaries but independent voices, all of this formed an impression that no lecture could have conveyed. They began to understand that order without fear was possible, that law could protect rather than dominate. Many of them carried this realization back across the Atlantic, where it merged with the rebuilding of a ruined nation. The lesson was not about America itself, but about the possibility of a moral structure larger than ideology. From the perspective of history, these moments appear almost modest: articles printed in wartime newspapers, classrooms set up in barracks, small acts of fairness repeated until they became habits. Yet their combined effect was immense. They demonstrated that civilization is not sustained by slogans or declarations, but by the consistent performance of justice in public view. The moral power of a society lies not in its capacity for punishment, but in its ability to extend dignity even to those who once sought its destruction. The legacy of those printed words, the editorials, the reports, the quiet insistence that prisoners retained their rights, was that they proved the endurance of a principle older than any nation, that humanity is indivisible. The American press had not defended German soldiers. It had defended the idea that no victory is complete if it demands the death of law itself. Long after the guns fell silent, what remained was not the sound of triumph, but the echo of restraint, the understanding that civilization survives when its conscience refuses to surrender.